You are standing in a candlelit chamber. The air reeks of sweat, wine, and decay. Behind the velvet curtains of Hampton Court, the most powerful king in Europe is not planning battles, but demanding obedience in the bedroom. What kind of man? Turn marriage into a weapon, desire into punishment, and women into pawns of lust and politics? Was Henry VIII truly searching for love? Or was his obsession with control the most terrifying game of all? And what did it truly cost the women? Trapped in his bed? This is not the story of a glorious king. It is the truth behind the horrifying sexual practices of Henry VIII. You are at the court of England in the early 1500s. The air smells of roses and sweat from the tilt yard, where the young Henry rides in dazzling armor. To the people, he's everything a king should be. Tall, broad-shouldered, with golden red hair and a smile that melts hearts. He sings, he hunts, he writes poetry, and when he walks into a hall, women glance down only to blush, while men straighten their backs in awe. Henry Tudor, not yet the tyrant remembered by history, is introduced to the world as a prince of romance. Courtiers whisper that he is the perfect blend of chivalry and passion, the living embodiment of King Arthur, reborn to rule. He composes songs for his beloved, plays the lute beneath candlelight, and pens verses in the language of courtly love. To the outside eye, his desires are pure, almost saintly. He seems the knight who lives only to serve his lady, but behind the soft words of poetry is a boy raised in shadows of power. Henry grew up watching his father, Henry VII, a ruler cold and calculating, suspicious of everyone. From the start, young Henry understood that love was never safe in a palace. That affection could be used as a chain. That devotion could be bent into obedience. So when Henry flirts, when he whispers sweet lines to women of the court, he's rehearsing something larger than love. He's testing his ability to capture hearts, not to surrender to them. Every smile is a conquest, every kiss a victory, every glance a reminder. He is the sun, and others orbit him. The world sees a charming prince, but Henry is already learning the intoxicating truth that desire in his hands can be more than tenderness. It can be power. In the golden halls of Greenwich Palace, Henry's laughter echoes like music. Servants scatter when he passes, going so low their foreheads nearly touch the floor. To most, this is devotion, but to Henry, it is confirmation of something deeper. He is meant not only to be loved, but to be worshipped at night when the court retires. He walks alone among the tapestries of saints and heroes. His eyes linger not on their battles, but on the way the world bends to their will. Power and pleasure, in his mind, they are not separate things. If knights fought for honor and kings ruled for glory, Henry would rule for both and claim pleasure as his birthright. It begins innocently enough. A court lady blushes when he takes her hand too long at a dance. He notices how quickly she lowers her gaze, how silence itself can be a tool of command. Another smiles when he praises her hair, only to feel the sting of jealousy when he turns the same compliment on her rival. Henry studies these reactions with the eye of a predator masked as a lover. The poets of his court sing of passion, of loyalty, of women as delicate flowers in need of protection. But Henry does not see flowers. He sees fields to be harvested, kingdoms to be conquered. Where others dream of romance, Henry feels the rush of possession. To him, intimacy is not simply affection. It is proof of dominance. Already, those closest to him sense the contradiction. His companions admire his charm, but whisper of his moods, sudden and stormy. A woman who resists too long becomes not a mystery to be solved, but a threat to his pride. And Henry's pride, even in youth, is sharp enough to wound. The mask of chivalry still hides his hunger, but cracks are forming. Soon, the world will see not a prince of love, but a man who believes desire itself is a crown to be worn. The court believes Henry's passion is a blessing. They see a prince who writes tender ballads, who kneels before his lady at tournaments, who pours his soul into songs of longing. But what they cannot see is the storm behind the smile. When Henry gazes at women, it is never simply as companions. In his heart, they are reflections of himself, mirrors of his power, proof that he is desired. He does not ask, he expects. Even when his tone is soft, even when his hand brushes gently, there is an unspoken law. To refuse him is unthinkable. In this way, his relationships begin to carry a hidden weight. To laugh at the wrong moment, to delay his advances, to spark even a flicker of doubt in his authority. Each becomes a subtle challenge to the future king. And challenges are dangerous. Yet to the outside world, Henry remains dazzling. Ambassadors describe him as the most magnificent prince in Christendom. The people of London call him their golden hope. In painted portraits, he shines with youth and vigor, a ruler destined for greatness. Only those trapped in the orbit of his desire sense the truth, that Henry's charm is not given freely, but demanded like tribute. And so, the stage is set. The mask of romance is firmly in place, hiding an appetite that will one day devour queens, destroy alliances, and reshape England itself. For now, Henry is still the adored prince, the poet king, the knight of love. But love, in his world, has already been rewritten. It is no longer about tenderness or equality. It is about control. The court does not yet know it, but the very qualities that make Henry irresistible, his passion, his intensity, his hunger to be adored, will become the same forces that turn his reign into a nightmare. The Golden Prince is rising, but beneath the silken song, a shadow is already growing. The palace is alive with whispers. Behind the polished marble floors, the glittering feasts, and the grand ceremonies, there are rumors, quiet, nervous murmurs about what happens when the king closes the doors of his private chambers. For the courtiers, Henry is still the radiant monarch. He hosts lavish banquets, challenges rivals to tournaments, and sings with a voice so bold it carries through stone halls. Yet, in the shadows of the Tudor court, servants trade stories. The king's desires are not like other men's. His bedroom, they say, is not a sanctuary of love, but a stage, a theater where loyalty, fear, and submission are tested. It begins with rituals. Women chosen for his attention are not courted like noble ladies, but examined like prizes. Their grace, their silence, their willingness to obey, all are measured, as though their worth is not in who they are, but how completely they bend to his will. A laugh too loud, a refusal too sharp, even a flicker of hesitation can bring disaster. These rules are never written, never spoken in daylight, but everyone at court knows them. To survive Henry's gaze is to play by his laws. A woman must be desirable yet modest, bold yet careful, playful yet submissive. It is a performance more dangerous than any mask, because the prize is not applause, it is survival. And what Henry desires most is not tenderness, but control. He does not simply want affection. He wants proof that he is irresistible, that no one can deny him. Even queens, cloaked in crowns and jewels, must act as if their love is entirely their own choice, when in truth it is commanded. The whispers spread faster than fire, but never too loudly. To speak too openly is to risk one's head. For the closer one is to Henry's bed, the closer one stands to the executioner's axe. In these secret chambers, power is rewritten into a strange performance. Courtiers speak of Henry demanding silence in moments when laughter should ring, of him commanding gestures, glances, and words as though he were not only King of England, but director of every breath around him. To him, intimacy is not shared, it is orchestrated. Women are expected to know their role instinctively, as if born into a script written by his obsession. Some endure in silence, hoping obedience will protect them. Others, bold or naive. Test the boundaries, and find that the king's temper is sharper than any blade thought at feasts. Henry will smile, raising goblets of wine, his laughter filling the hall. But later, in the quiet of candlelit chambers, the game begins. A glance from across the room can summon a woman into his orbit. A touch of his hand is not a question, but a command. Once drawn in, she must play along with the delicate rules. Eyes lowered at the right moment, words spoken with the right mixture of fear and devotion. Some see opportunity in these games. Families push their daughters forward, desperate for royal favor, willing to risk scandal and ruin for the chance of influence. Yet others tremble, knowing that the king's desire is a double-edged sword. What wins his attention today may bring suspicion tomorrow, even the queen's. Those who share his crown are trapped within these rituals. Catherine of Aragon, once adored, learns that being his lawful wife does not shield her from his hunger for new games. Anne Boleyn, clever and ambitious, dares to bend the rules to her advantage, and finds herself both elevated and endangered. For Henry, the chamber is not a place of intimacy. It is an arena, a battlefield where he must always emerge victorious. And as the years pass, his private obsessions begin to shape the entire court, as though every man and woman in England is caught inside his endless performance. The danger of these forbidden games is not only in the king's desire, but in the consequences of breaking his invisible laws. One wrong move, one slip of the mask, and whispers of betrayal can turn into charges of treason. Those who refuse him, or even hesitate, find themselves accused of disloyalty. For Henry, denial is not a personal slight. It is an act of rebellion against the crown itself. To resist his advances is to challenge his supremacy, and challenges must be crushed. Thus, intimacy becomes inseparable from politics, the bedroom, indistinguishable from the throne room. What makes these rules most terrifying is their secrecy. There is no guide, no warning, no safety. A woman may think she has pleased him, only to find the next morning that she has fallen out of favor, replaced, or worse, disgraced. Each encounter is a gamble with life and legacy for the kings. Obsession is as unstable as it is consuming, and so the palace breathes in silence. Servants avert their eyes. Courtiers flatter without rest. Queens smile through clenched teeth. All know the truth, but none dare speak it. Henry's desires have become law, and his law is merciless. The world beyond the palace gates will never see these rituals. To the people, Henry is still the golden monarch, the great reformer, the father of the nation. But within the palace walls, those closest to him live in fear of the unspoken rules, where a gesture, a word, or even a glance can determine their fate. The games are no longer just whispers. They are the invisible chains that bind the Tudor court. And as Henry grows more powerful, those chains will only tighten, pulling even queens into his theater of submission. The mask of chivalry is cracking. The truth is beginning to show. The wedding bells of Tudor England rang with promise. Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess raised with dignity and faith, entered her marriage to Henry, believing she had found both love and stability. To her, the young king was gallant, poetic, and loyal, a man who would cherish her as a partner in faith and rule. For a brief moment, it seemed true. The court adored their union, and Catherine's gentle strength softened Henry's fiery spirit. But as the years passed, Catherine began to see the bars of her gilded cage. Henry's affection was never steady. It rose and fell with her ability to give him what he wanted most, a son. Every miscarriage, every child lost, every daughter born became a silent wound between them. For Catherine, marriage was supposed to be sacred. For Henry, it became a contract of utility, love measured in heirs, affection poisoned by frustration. The Queen's chambers grew colder. The laughter of their youth gave way to Henry's silences, his temper, his wandering eye. Catherine endured, as queens were expected to, patient, dignified, unbroken in public. But behind the doors of the palace, she carried the weight of failure in Henry's eyes. Her body became the battlefield of his dynasty, her womb judged as the measure of her worth. For Catherine, the bed was no longer a place of love, but of obligation. She prayed, she wept, she begged God for deliverance. Yet each morning, she rose with a smile, her duty carved into silence. In the glittering court of England, the Queen's crown was not a symbol of power, but of captivity. When Anne Boleyn stepped into Catherine's place, she too believed she was chosen for love. Anne was different, bold, sharp, and ambitious. She resisted Henry's advances at first, refusing to be just another mistress. That resistance, paradoxically, only fueled Henry's desire. He saw in her a challenge, a puzzle to solve, and soon his obsession tore England apart. Anne's refusal to surrender easily gave her leverage. Henry bent laws, broke with Rome, and destroyed centuries of faith just to place her beside him as queen. For a moment, Anne believed she had won, not just Henry's passion, but his devotion. She entered the marriage with fire, believing her intelligence and wit would secure her place. But queens in Henry's world were never equals. Anne quickly discovered the same truth Catherine had lived with for decades. Love was conditional, and loyalty was demanded. Where once Henry admired her sharp tongue, now he bristled at her defiance. Where he praised her independence, now he saw insolence. The very qualities that had lured him became the weapons used against her in the royal bedchamber. The pattern repeated. Anne was praised when she pleased him, punished with coldness when she did not. Her ability to give him a son became the thread upon which her life dangled. Each failed pregnancy brought whispers of witchcraft, betrayal, or God's punishment. She was never simply a wife. She was a vessel, judged for her body's ability to serve the dynasty. Anne's prison was not just built of stone walls, but of expectations, of rules she had no power to write. What she thought would be a throne of love became a stage of torment, where her every gesture was scrutinized. Like Catherine before her, she discovered that Henry's devotion was never safe. It was a weapon he wielded until it broke the women who bore it. To the outside world, queens of England glittered in jewels, their names sung in ballads, their portraits painted with regal serenity. But behind the curtains of the royal chambers, they endured a silence that history seldom records. Catherine of Aragon spent her later years cast aside, stripped of her title, and left to wither in isolation. Her marriage, once a union of kingdoms, ended with a letter cold as iron. She was no longer queen, merely the Dowager Princess of Wales. She died alone, her prayers unanswered, her body broken by years of childbearing and grief. Anne Boleyn's cage was even crueler. She had risen higher than any woman dared dream, only to fall in the most brutal way. Accused of adultery, witchcraft, and treason, she was condemned not only as a failed queen, but as a monster. The very bed where she once believed herself triumphant became the foundation of her death sentence. Her final days were spent in the Tower, awaiting the sword that would sever her head from her body. These women, once adorned in silks and diamonds, were reduced to pawns in Henry's private torment. Their suffering was not just personal. It was systemic, written into the very structure of Tudor rule. To marry Henry was to step into a prison without bars, where obedience was survival and silence was the only defense. The wives of Henry VIII entered his bed with hope, with dreams of partnership, with faith in the vows of marriage. But they soon learned the truth. In his world, queens were not beloved companions. They were symbols, tools, and sacrifices. Their love was never enough. Their lives were never safe. The palace glittered with feasts, music, and jewels. But for Catherine and Anne, and for those who would follow, the crown was nothing more than a shackle. Desire once burned like fire in Henry's veins, but as the years passed, fire gave way to smoke, acrid, choking, and filled with suspicion. What once thrilled him now terrified him. Where he once sought love, he began to see betrayal. For Henry, passion and paranoia were inseparable. Every smile that lingered too long, every glance exchanged between courtiers, every whisper in the corridors could become proof of treachery. He did not see innocent laughter. He saw secrets. He did not see companionship. He saw plots. And when suspicion crept into his marriage bed, it transformed intimacy into interrogation. Anne Boleyn was the first and most famous victim of this metamorphosis. Once adored, now accused, she became the subject of Henry's darkest fantasies. Of betrayal. In the king's eyes, her wit had turned to venom, her charm to seduction, her ambition to manipulation. To him, she was no longer a queen. She was a traitor lying beside him, poisoning his dynasty from within. But Anne was not alone. Henry's gaze turned upon his wives with the same pattern. Love, desire, doubt, and then destruction. Queens were no longer just wives. They were suspects in an endless trial, judged not in courts of law, but in the king's own restless mind. The royal bedchamber became a dangerous theater. A sigh could be mistaken for contempt. A refusal could be twisted into treachery. And in Henry's England, treachery was not a flaw. It was a death sentence. The accusations came like storms, sudden, brutal, and impossible to escape. Anne Boleyn was charged with adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. The evidence was flimsy. The witnesses terrified, but Henry needed no proof. His paranoia was proof enough. To accuse a queen of infidelity was not only to condemn her, it was to erase her. Her crown, her love, her dignity, even her motherhood was stripped away in a single breath. A queen accused became a witch, a temptress, a danger to the very soul of England. Henry's paranoia reached beyond the walls of his chamber. To the court, every move became a test of loyalty. Men and women alike learned that to fall from the king's favor was to risk not only disgrace, but the axe. Courtiers whispered prayers not for their souls, but for their safety, as one wrong. Word could link them to a queen's downfall. The most chilling transformation was how Henry turned desire into evidence. The same qualities that had once drawn him, a smile, a flirtation, a spark of independence, now became the very proof of a woman's guilt. What he craved yesterday, he condemned today. And those condemned rarely escaped alive. Anne's fall was the clearest example. The queen who had once been his obsession now became the scapegoat for every disappointment, every failed son, every insecurity. Her execution was not just punishment. It was the final act of their intimacy. The sword replacing the kiss. The bedroom had become the courtroom, and in Henry's reign, guilty was the only verdict. Anne Boleyn's death sent shockwaves through England, but it did not end Henry's pattern. It cemented it. Each new wife carried not only the weight of his desire, but also the shadow of his suspicion. Jane Seymour, gentle and obedient, seemed to soothe him for a time, but her early death spared her the torment of accusation. Others were not so fortunate. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, was swept into his bed and soon swept into his paranoia. Her laughter, her youth, her indiscretions before marriage, all became weapons against her. When whispers of her past reached the king, suspicion blazed into fury. Henry had her dragged to the Tower, accused of adultery, and executed with cold efficiency. What made these deaths most horrifying was their intimacy. These were not enemies on a battlefield, not foreign traitors plotting against the crown. These were women who had once lain beside him, whispered to him in the dark, shared his most private moments. The same bed where they sought comfort became the stage where their doom was written. To Henry, desire was always dangerous. To love him was to live under constant surveillance, where affection could at any moment be twisted into guilt. He could not separate passion from power, nor love from fear. And so, every kiss carried a risk. Every touch held the shadow of the axe by the end. Henry's reign was soaked in both desire and blood, so intertwined that one could not exist without the other. To be loved by the king was perilous. To be desired was deadly. The court of England had become a labyrinth of suspicion, where the most intimate secrets became public trials, and where the king's embrace could just as easily lead to the scaffold. From the beginning, Henry's obsession with love was tangled with a deeper hunger, the hunger for a son. To him, an heir was not only proof of his masculinity, but the very survival of his dynasty. The Tudor crown was young, fragile, built on the blood of civil war. Without a son, Henry feared his kingdom would crumble, and his name would vanish like dust in the wind. This desperation turned the royal bed into a battlefield of reproduction. Queens were no longer wives. They were vessels, their bodies weighed, and judged by the children they bore. A daughter meant disappointment. A miscarriage meant shame. A stillborn child meant anger. To fail Henry in this duty was to risk both disgrace and death. Catherine of Aragon learned this with every failed pregnancy. Anne Boleyn discovered it when her daughter Elizabeth could not satisfy his need for a male heir. Each woman entered the marriage bed with hope and left with sorrow, their love measured not by devotion, but by the survival of sons. Yet Henry's cruelty was not only to his wives. Mistresses, too, became pawns in this desperate game. Courtiers whispered of secret affairs, of women chosen not for passion, but for their ability to prove Henry's virility. A mistress who bore a healthy son was rewarded, flaunted as proof that the king was fertile, even if it meant humiliating his queen. A woman who failed was discarded like a broken tool. In this way, Henry turned intimacy into a political weapon. Children were not just born. They were symbols, bargaining chips in the chessboard of Tudor power. And as his desperation deepened, so too did his cruelty. Rumors ran like wildfire through the Tudor court. Some said Henry demanded physicians examine his wives, their bodies reduced to instruments of reproduction. Others whispered that astrologers and priests were summoned to explain why God denied him sons. But behind these stories lay a single truth. Women were no longer individuals in Henry's eyes. They were extensions of his dynasty, their worth tied only to their WOMB stud. When Jane Seymour gave him the son he craved, Edward, she was exalted as the perfect queen. Yet even this triumph was poisoned. Jane died days after childbirth, and Henry wept as though she had been his one true love. But was it love for Jane, or love for the heir she had given him? For once again, a woman's value was defined not by her heart, but by what her body produced. The pattern became undeniable. Love was fleeting, but legacy was eternal. Henry reshaped the very fabric of England to secure it. He broke with Rome, destroyed monasteries, executed nobles, all under the banner of protecting his dynasty. Yet behind the grandeur of politics, it was always the same private desperation, the fear of dying. Without a son, mistresses carried their own burden in this system. Some sought power through their proximity to the king, believing his favor would elevate their families. Others dreaded his gaze, knowing that his attention could as easily destroy as it could reward. For Henry, a mistress was never truly a woman. She was a test of his masculinity, proof of his potency, a public demonstration that the king's body was as powerful as his crown. In the end, even love itself became meaningless. Affection, loyalty, laughter, these were fleeting. But a child, a son, was immortal. And Henry would sacrifice everything, even the women closest to him, to manufacture that legacy. The fusion of sex and politics in Henry's reign was absolute. Every bedchamber decision rippled outward into the court, the church, and the nation itself. When he loved, entire factions rose to power. When he cast aside, families fell into ruin. A queen's fertility could shift the course of England's destiny more than any army. But this system came at a terrible cost. Women became pawns, their identities erased in the shadow of Henry's desperation. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Each was remembered not for who they were, but for how they fit into the king's endless quest for heirs. They were saints or sinners, heroines or villains, but never simply women. Even beyond the queens, Henry's reputation as a lover was twisted into political theater. Rumors of his virility were carefully managed, spread by allies, suppressed by enemies. His mistresses were paraded or hidden depending on the needs of the moment. Every kiss, every child, every secret meeting was entangled with questions of power. And yet, despite all his efforts, his legacy remained fragile. The son he fought so desperately for, Edward, would die young. His daughters, the very children he had dismissed as disappointments, would inherit his throne and define the Tudor age more powerfully than he ever imagined. That irony was the cruelest. Truth of all, Henry destroyed wives, broke kingdoms, and bled his soul dry in search of a male legacy, only for England's future to be carried by women. But in his lifetime, Henry never saw it that way. To him, women were not saviors of the crown, but instruments of survival. His marriages were not partnerships, but contracts. His passion was not love, but hunger disguised as devotion. And so the legacy he manufactured was not only one of bloodlines, but of blood itself. A reign where the private hungers of one man reshaped the destiny of a nation. The Henry who once dazzled Europe with his strength and beauty was gone. The golden prince of tournaments, songs, and seduction had become a grotesque shadow of himself. His legs, once powerful in the jousting field, were now swollen and ulcerous, oozing with infection. His body, once the very image of chivalry, had grown monstrous, bloated by disease and gluttony. And yet, it was not only his flesh that decayed, it was his desire. The bedchamber that once served as his throne of dominance had turned into a place of humiliation. Where he once demanded obedience and passion, now he demanded only care. Servants to dress his wounds, doctors to soothe his pain, attendants to hide the stench of his rotting body. But worse than the physical decay was the paranoia. The king who had once ruled with fiery passion now ruled through suspicion. Every whisper in court, every glance between courtiers, seemed like a plot. He accused allies, condemned nobles, and watched shadows as if they carried knives. His own body had betrayed him, and so he trusted no one. The women he had once adored, broken, or discarded haunted him. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Catherine Howard. They returned to him in memory, not as lovers, but as specters. Their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. The ghosts of their suffering wrapped around him like a shroud, reminding him that the empire he built in flesh was built also on blood. And in his silence, Henry was forced to face the cruelest truth. Desire, the force that had once defined him, was gone. The king who had conquered women, nations, and even the church now found himself conquered by his own failing body. At night, his bedchamber was heavy with silence, broken only by his labored breathing. The women who had once entered his bed with fear or hope were replaced by physicians and priests. His once insatiable appetites for food, for sex, for power had collapsed into one craving alone: survival. But survival was not enough. For Henry, whose life had been consumed by dominance, survival without desire was a kind of death. His body still sat on the throne, his crown still gleamed. With jewels, but his essence, the charm, the hunger, the passion, had withered. The man who once commanded through fear and seduction now commanded only pity. The courtiers around him played their roles carefully. To his face, they bowed and smiled, speaking of his greatness. Behind his back, they whispered of the monster he had become. The once gallant king who inspired poetry and fear was now a lumbering figure, carried on litters, hidden behind layers of velvet and fur to disguise his decline. It was then that Henry felt the weight of his sins most sharply. He had destroyed women who had loved him, condemned queens who had shared his bed, executed friends who had stood by his side. For what? For sons who died young. For a dynasty that trembled on weak legs. For a legacy that, despite all his cruelty, remained uncertain. His wives' faces returned in visions. Catherine's quiet dignity, Anne's fiery defiance, Jane's pale fragility, Catherine Howard's terrified youth, Catherine Parr's cautious tenderness. They were all with him, as if the bed that once devoured them now demanded payment from him. Their presence was not forgiving. It was accusing. The man who once sought worship from women now felt condemned by them, his every breath an echo of their silent screams. In the final months, Henry's bed ceased to be a stage of conquest. It became his coffin, long before he drew his last breath. The sheets that once smelled of perfume and power now reeked of pus and sweat. He no longer reached for women, no, longer commanded devotion. He simply clung to life as it slipped between his fingers. His death was not swift nor noble. It was slow, heavy, suffocating. Each night he lay awake, trapped in his decaying body, staring into the darkness. The voices of priests offered him salvation, but the voices in his own mind drowned them out. Whispers of betrayal, screams of queens, the silence of children buried too young. The once great lover of Europe, the man who remade kingdoms for desire, ended not in romance, but in ruin. His final days were lived in a body that mocked him, a kingdom that waited impatiently for his passing, and a legacy far weaker than he had sacrificed so much to build. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. The man who spent his life using women as tools of dynasty left behind a world where women defined his future. Catherine's daughter Mary and Anne's daughter Elizabeth would rule England with a power Henry himself never imagined. The daughters he scorned, ignored, and feared would carry the Tudor name into immortality. But Henry did not live to see it. For him there was no redemption, no poetic justice, only decline. His bed, once his throne of pleasure and control, became his prison, his confessional, and finally his grave. The death of desire was the death of Henry himself. For a man who defined his very existence through appetite, conquest, and passion, there was no fate more cruel than to live long enough to feel them all rot away.